Whether you have had the pleasure of playing a Sega Saturn or not, unfortunately most gamers weren't privy to the wonders this console provided. It was underrated for sure, but some of the titles released on it were some of the most unique gaming experiences of the 32-bit era. Let's take a look at my top 10 Sega Saturn hidden gems, or games you've probably never heard of. Yo, it's the Retro Mark Cruz and welcome back to the channel. Today I actually wanted to talk about one of my favorite consoles of all time, and that would be the Sega Saturn, the almighty Sega Saturn. Also the red-headed stepchild of the Sega line, the Sega Saturn. You may have heard of it, maybe you have never seen one, maybe you've never played one, but for me the Sega Saturn is one of my favorite consoles, and it's one of the ones that I spent a lot of time on as a child, not only playing these games like in depth, but really this was one of the first ones that I actually started to collect for. The Sega Saturn holds a very near and dear place in my heart. It's the one that I always gravitate to when I want to play something to remind me of a great time. So in this list, I'm going to talk about my top 10 hidden gems for the Sega Saturn. Some games you may have heard of, some games may be completely new, but let me just lay some ground rules for these, right? One, a lot of these that you're going to see here, either I owned when I was a child or I rebought as an adult, right? Two, I'm actually not listing any role-playing games for the most part because I want to make a separate list specifically for those. Role-playing games are some of my favorite types of games to play, and I think that deserves its own list, so I'm going to leave those off, right? Next, most of these games are Sega Saturn exclusives, but some may not be. I'm showing them on this list because for me, my experience with them was on the Sega Saturn first. And of course, these are all American released games, okay? So let's get right into it. First up on my list, I have Shinobi Legions. Shinobi Legions is probably one of the least mentioned games in the entire series. Maybe it's because many gamers missed out on the Sega Saturn, or most people simply had no idea that it came out. Developed by Sega and published by Vic Takai Inc. in 1995, Shinobi Legions is a side-scrolling action game based in the Shinobi series of games. The story essentially revolves around a family of descendants from the Shinobi clan. The main character you play is named Sho, while his brother Kazuma is the villain, who even goes as far as kidnapping their sister, but we'll get to that. Yeah, this Kazuma dude is a complete dirtbag, but that's what makes a successful villain. I mean, you gotta hate him a little bit to make the game worth playing, right? The game tells its story through a number of film sequences that tie into the whole aesthetic the game is going for. Today, yeah, let's be real, they look kinda cheap and dated, but back then, this was revolutionary. Low-grade MPEG files with grainy visuals to tell the story. The 90s sure was a simpler time. From a graphical perspective, the game literally looks like B-roll footage left over from an early Mortal Kombat game. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way though. I mean, for the time, the graphics were on point compared to, the Genesis games in the series, but it definitely leaned heavily into the whole motion capture graphics craze of the early to mid 90s. The gameplay is essentially what you'd expect from a Shinobi game. However, this time around, the game relies more on the hero's katana as opposed to the shuriken throwing of previous games. Unlike previous games, the 4 ninjutsu techniques are no longer here. Instead, you find different items and orbs for your power-ups and your specials. The game itself takes you on this fantastic journey through 9 levels all over the world. The stages range from, feudal Japan, to a jungle, to something that even looks like a underground cloning facility? I don't know. Listen, they even had an action figure dragon as an enemy. Look at that, state-of-the-art graphics. All in all, Shinobi Legions is a great game in the series, and it's a hidden gem that you should definitely play on the Saturn. At number 9, I have Virtual On. Virtual On Cyber Troopers is a 3D mech fighting game developed by Sega's AM3 division and published by Sega in 1996. It was the first game in the Virtual On series, and I believe it was one of the first, if not literally the first, 3D robot fighting game. I remember when this game was first released, as a young child who, couldn't differentiate many franchises at the time, I thought this was a Gundam fighting game. That was like the main reason why I tried it in the first place. Imagine my surprise when I saw no Gundams. What confused me even more as a child? The intro of this game literally has a song that sounds very similar to the Chrono Trigger fight theme. Don't believe me? Check this out. Anyway, the game itself consists of mechs beating the crap out of each other with guns, grenades, energy blast, and these lightsaber-like swords. You have your choice of the 8 base mechs to choose from, all with their own styles and strengths. The gameplay itself is fast-paced and frenetic. Your goal is super simple: destroy your opponent's mech before the timer runs out. The story is pretty generic, with this whole set in the future when a mega corporation takes over the world and has access to life-changing tech plot we've heard before, so the story is definitely not the game's strong point. What sets this game apart though was on the Saturn in Japan, you were able to use a peripheral named the Twin Sticks to control this game. We never got it here in America, unfortunately, but it looks like it would have been a lot of fun to use. Also, there was like a Sega Saturn Netlink version of this game that was released that allowed you to play online with your friends. At the time, this was almost unheard of for console gaming, so that was a plus as well. If you don't happen to have a Saturn handy, you can play this game in Yakuza Kiwami 2 in the arcades. Do yourself a favor and definitely check this out. At number 8, I have Astal, or Astal, depending on how you pronounce it. Astal is a 2D side-scrolling platforming game developed and published by Sega in 1995. It was one of the first games released for the Sega Saturn, and till this day, it's still one of the best platforming games you can play on the console. The story begins when the goddess Antoaz created the world from a single jewel. She then goes on to create 2 main characters from 2 separate jewels. Astal, your main character, was created from a red one, along with a girl named Lita, who was created from a green one. The goddess then goes on for a long slumber and wakes up when Astal is attempting to save Lita from an evil menace, Gerardo, and his creation Geist. The goddess then gets all pissed off and banishes Astal to the moon, but Lita gets kidnapped again. Sounds like, the Princess Peach kidnapping plot, but hey, that's the core elements of this story. In terms of the game itself, there are a number of differences in the American version compared to the Japanese version. For example, the Japanese version gives you 5 life points and unlimited continues, but the American version only gives you 3 life points and 1 continue. The graphics in this game were great for its time, and they used this hand-drawn style to create the world in this game. It is colorful, and to me, it even has this like Vanillaware type of graphical style if you've played any of those games. The world reminds me of a Disney movie of sorts, but if it took like a slightly darker twist. The game also features voices and key parts, so for the time, that was great. The music, it sets the tone like of a cavernous underworld and definitely fits in with the game. The gameplay in Astal is pretty straightforward, thankfully. Your character can attack, throw, grab, punch, jump, and hey, he even has this like Kirby type of move in which your character can literally breathe in air and spit it out to blow your enemies away. Also, most people aren't aware of this, but if you plug in a second controller, the second player can actually control the bird. Although the game is a bit short, Astal is a great platformer that offers a good challenge, and it's an interesting experience on the Sega Saturn. At number 7, I have Bug 2. Bug 2 is a platforming game sequel to the original Bug on the Sega Saturn. It was developed by Real Time Associates and Sega Soft, and published by Sega in 1996. The game revolves around action film stars Bug, Maggot Dog, and of course, Superfly. They are signed to a 6-picture deal, but all 6 movies have to be filmed the same day because their manager is a greedy jerk who clearly got them a terrible deal. So, Bug 2 definitely screams the 90s for me. It has that early 90s humor that was prominently found at that time. The levels in this game are mostly parodies of real movies, but with a twist of course. The gameplay itself is improved upon slightly from the first game. As with most platformers, your goal is to simply make it to the end of the stage in one piece. In this game though, you can now run, play with 2 players, and choose from different characters. What made this game unique at the time was your ability to move between planes. Although the game mostly moved on like a 2D plane, you could walk in and out of the background to give you a 3D perspective as well. The camera angles, well, at times they could be a huge pain and could create a lot of frustration. I guess for the time this was literally the best that they could do. What set this game apart for me was the humor and the interesting gameplay mechanics. Platformers for a while, they all kind of felt very similar to me, so I remember this being a nice fresh take for the genre. All in all, the game isn't going to win any awards, and to be honest, it is a lot like the first game, but if you haven't tried this game out, you definitely should give it a shot. At number 6, I have Clockwork Knight 2. Wouldn't it be cool if toys came to life, had adventures on their own, and hey, maybe even one could attempt to save the damsel in distress? Well, if you think I'm describing Toy Story, I'm not. I'm actually describing the Clockwork Knight franchise that predated the Pixar classic. Clockwork Knight 2 is the sequel to the original Clockwork Knight and was developed and published by Sega in 1995. Ironically, both games came out in the same year, with the original being released in May, and this sequel being released in December of 1995. Clockwork Knight 2 is a side-scrolling platformer featuring the hero from the first game, Pepper Chow. The game itself takes place directly after the events of the first game, and it's a perfect continuation of that story. Graphically, the game looks identical to the first, and for its time, it had amazing 3D graphics. Remember, this was around the time Donkey Kong Country was released on the Super Nintendo, so you can see graphically this game was heavily influenced by that. The story and the gameplay itself aren't earth-shattering by any means, but the gameplay is solid and the game is nice and short. If you're looking for a simple yet reliable platform experience on the Sega Saturn, you can't go wrong with Clockwork Knight 2. Coming in at number 5, I have Die Hard the arcade game. Die Hard the arcade game is a 3D arcade beat-em-up developed by AM1 and published by Sega in 1997. According to Wikipedia, it was the first beat-em-up to use texture map 3D polygon graphics, which I did not know until I started putting this together. Wow, okay. Well, I guess that explains why this pseudo John McClane looking guy looks nothing like Bruce Willis. Of course, I mean, other than licensing issues, I'm sure, but now that I can't bash on the graphics so much, I kind of feel bad. I mean, it was a pioneer, so I will be respectful, but let me just put it out there. This game looks blocky as hell. Although it has Die Hard in the name, the game has nothing to do with the films or that universe in terms of the story or anything like that. In Japan, this was actually a game named Dynamite Deca, and since Sega didn't have the rights for the Die Hard license in Japan, it became its own franchise over there. The game does incorporate some elements that are familiar to fans of the movies, like crazy explosions and over-the-top action that was prevalent in a lot of action films at that time. The game is also funny at times too, so that definitely helps. The story is as generic as it gets, so I'll skip over that part, but for me, the gameplay is really the core of this game. The fighting mechanics, the items that you can use, and the little combos all made this such an enjoyable experience to me. The game also features 2-player co-op, so if you have any real-life friends, you can enjoy some old-school couch co-op with them. The comedy, and at times some of the off-the-wall things that happen in this game, also made for a great time. Listen, the game was intentionally funny, of course, but there were times when I found myself laughing at points where maybe they weren't meant to be funny. Like my dude John McClane fighting barefoot on a roof, or the clotheslining of an enemy in a hallway that rotates his body like a torpedo, or, look at this, the size of the bad guy's cell phone / walkie-talkie. Like, why does this look so much bigger than his head? Why? Oh wait, let's not forget this gem. Gets me every time. Anyway, one of the things I hated as a kid was the QuickTime events. Listen, as a child, my reflexes were slow as molasses. The exciting gameplay, it overwhelmed my little adolescent mind. So, to see these huge flashing prompts, screaming at you to press A, press B, whatever, when you least expect it scared the hell out of me. I couldn't think that fast, so I would mess up more often than I'd like to admit. And did I mention the horrible graphics? The little girl gave me nightmares, man. All in all, if you're looking for simple, brainless fun, Die Hard the arcade game is definitely the way to go. Moving right along, at number 4, I have 3 Dirty Dwarves. Listen, if you weren't around or you were too young to remember the early 90s, it might surprise you to know that there was a time when being dirty, nasty, creepy, and disgusting, and things like that, they were all considered cool or rad. The filthier, the better was the way to be for a little while, or so it seemed to me. Listen, I was a little Hispanic kid from the Bronx. My mom didn't allow anything dirty in the house like that, or anything that brought filth or grime would be considered nothing short of blasphemous. So, if I didn't want to be greeted by the almighty chancleta, I was highly encouraged not to partake in any of that. Anyhow, 3 Dirty Dwarves was clearly targeted at that demographic who was into that sort of thing. It was developed by Appaloosa Interactive and published by Sega Soft in 1996. Fun fact, originally this game was also announced for the PlayStation as well, since Sega Soft really wanted to acquire a PlayStation software license, but they never published any games for the PlayStation. The story itself involves 4 kids who are stuck playing a D&D type of board game as they are studied by the military. They end up opening an interdimensional gate as they are confined, which brings the 3 dwarves into the real world. The dwarves then rob the local sporting goods store and arm themselves for combat. The gameplay itself was very interesting at the time. If you were playing alone, you would first control one of the 3 doors, but you had the ability to change to any of the other ones at any time. If you were knocked out, you could play a separate dwarf and smack your down one to revive them. However, if you happened to have a friend around, or if you were super special and owned the Sega Saturn multi-tap, you and 2 friends could all play at the exact same time. It was the first 3-player beat-em-up for consoles that I ever played as a kid, so having 2 other brothers, I felt like, wow, this game spoke to us. Anyhow, each dwarf had its own style of fighting and weapon to use, so that made each one helpful in very specific scenarios. I always preferred the dude with the shotgun though. The graphics in this game were very impressive as well. The story played out in these hand-drawn cartoon sequences, and the gameplay itself had a hand-drawn look to it with semi-3D elements. The Saturn had a number of great beat-em-ups, but 3 Dirty Dwarves is one I highly suggest that you try sometime. At number 3, I have Guardian Heroes. Guardian Heroes is a classic and, in my opinion, legendary 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up developed by the almighty Treasure and published by Sega in 1996. This game was one of the first games I had played on the Saturn. We originally had like a loose copy from Funkoland back in the day, but in my lifetime I've owned about 4 copies of this game since there were times I had sold it or traded it for other games. This game for me is like one of the greatest beat-em-ups of all time, hands down. It has a great story, an amazing roster of characters to play, and it has this like skill, experience points based system that allows you to upgrade your character over the course of the story. According to Wikipedia, the game also had a karma system if you killed the NPCs. Oh damn, oops, I had no idea. Yeah, so what was unique at the time was the multi-layer or multi-plane mechanic that allowed you to jump backwards and forwards in any level. This was one of the first games that I played in this genre that had branching paths and multiple endings, so it offered a ton of replay value for us as kids. Oh, so remember that multi-tap thing I mentioned earlier? Well, this was another game where you could use it. In this game, you could use it in the versus mode where up to 6 people can play at the same time, and you can choose from over 44 different playable characters. Listen, I've never actually played a bad Treasure developed game, and this still holds true to that sentiment. It is a great experience, and if you don't have a Saturn handy, or if you aren't willing to sell a kidney to get the game, well, you can experience this game in all its HD glory on Xbox Live Arcade. Alright, we're getting towards the end of the list here. At number 2, I have Herc's Adventures. So, what would you get if you mixed the gameplay of Zombies Ate My Neighbors with a little bit of Greek mythology? Well, LucasArts had the same idea, and with it, Herc's Adventures was born. Developed by Big 8 Productions and published by LucasArts in 1997, Herc's Adventures was actually intended to be a Sega Saturn exclusive when it was originally developed. However, after delays and setbacks, those plans changed and it was also released on the PlayStation. Ironically, when I first played it, I was so blown away though. I had never played a game that afforded me so much exploratory freedom, and at the time, the world seemed so vast and so big, I thought I'd never beat the game, and years later, I still haven't completed it, but I digress, my friends. Now, in terms of the presentation, I was a huge fan of the quirky cartoon style and the voices in this game. I loved the scenes where these huge characters would just show up on screen and start to talk to you out of nowhere or scream at you or whatever. The humor in this game always made me chuckle, whether it was eating gyros to heal, flexing in front of an ancient personal trainer to increase your stats, or Herc's random outburst saying, "My dad's a god."
My dad's a god!
Definitely made this unique for its time. The gameplay itself was fun and addicting. I mean, for the style of gameplay, it is inherent for a game like this to kind of feel a bit repetitive, but hey, I didn't care. That was part of the quirky charm to me. One of the most amazing feats for its time though was the fact that the game didn't have any loading screens other than when you went to and from the underworld. Crazy to think that this entire world was rendered like this at that time. Listen, Herc's Adventures may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I suggest if you have the means to buy it, since it's pretty expensive these days, give this a try and preferably with a friend. And coming in at number 1, I have Burning Rangers. Burning Rangers. One of the last 5 Sega Saturn games released in North America. Developed by Sonic Team and published by Sega in 1998, it was the game that I was most intrigued by at the time. I remember seeing ads and previews for it before it was released, and I was just in awe at how unique this game looked. At the time, you didn't see many refined third-person shooter games that had this much polish. Its premise was also extremely unique. Essentially, you played as a futuristic firefighter that is tasked with saving civilians from areas that look kind of like futuristic vaults of some sort. The gameplay allowed you to shoot fire with a blaster, and you were also given a jetpack to help you navigate through the levels. Like Sonic, you had to collect a jewel, so instead of rings, you had to collect crystals. You would need at least 5 crystals to save a civilian, but also like Sonic, if you got hit, you dropped them all over the place. One of the aspects that set this game apart at the time was that for you to navigate through the levels themselves, you had to listen to voice directions that were given to you, or you had to use the old school method of memorization to recall the layouts of the level. You didn't have access to a mini-map or any waypoints or anything, so if you weren't listening or paying any mind to what was being said, you could easily get lost. Speaking about voices, the voice acting in this game was top-notch for its time. Back then, games that had any kind of voice work were always kind of hit or miss in terms of their execution. This game, however, since the voice work is extremely vital to the experience, it was performed very, very well. The game also had a number of anime-style cutscenes in it to relay the story, so that was a great addition as well. The controls weren't the best, to be honest. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but replaying this game today, I couldn't help but wonder how much better this game would play if the Saturn had a controller with dual analog sticks. We only had the 3D pad, which wasn't that bad, but it's the best tool that you have to play this game. Fun fact, what I found out in researching this game for this video is apparently when the game was originally in production, it was planned to be an online game for 4 players. Unfortunately, that didn't make it into the final release, but that concept became the core of what the team used to develop Phantasy Star Online for the Dreamcast a few years later. In terms of the graphics, I think it's one of the better looking games on the Sega Saturn. There are a lot of games that graphically didn't age well from that era, but for what it is, Burning Rangers definitely holds up. Burning Rangers for me was one of the defining game experiences for the Sega Saturn, and what sucks the most unfortunately is that it was released to very little fanfare and it had a super small production run. Because of that, most people never played or even heard of this game, and to buy it now is beyond what most people are willing to pay for a game. Hopefully, it's either re-released on current consoles or remade altogether.
Shell, I'm with you. We need to destroy the joint, right?
It's at the bottom level. Let's go.
And that, my friends, is my top 10 Sega Saturn hidden gems list. If there was a game that you thought should have been on this list, or a game that you thought should have been number 1 or anything like that, hey, let me know. I haven't played every single Sega Saturn game, and as of right now, I don't have a full Sega Saturn collection. Just yet. Wait and see, and let's see how that goes, alright? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and of course hit the notification bell to be notified of any new videos I put on this channel. And until next time, see you on the next one.